Are we on? Can you hear me? Before we begin, I'm curious, I'm sure others, how many in the room have worked at Menninger? Michelle, you don't have to raise your hand. How many of you are part of a family, are connected to Menninger by marriage or parenthood? Okay. How many of you know the person you're sitting next to? Okay. If you don't, please turn to them now and introduce yourself just quickly.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Paul Post, and I am happy to welcome you tonight to the Menninger Roundtable, which is sponsored by the Topeka and Shawnee County Public Library and the Shawnee County Historical Society. I happen to be a trustee with the Historical Society, and this organization has been around since 1945, and we celebrate the wonderful history of Shawnee County. We encourage you to consider becoming a member of the Historical Society if you're so inclined. We do have upcoming programs that you might want to consider, including January 6th with Mark Bierenheide speaking on his Potman lofts and other lofts that he has developed. February 6th featuring Marshall Barber. I'm sure many of you remember him from his radio days, and he's talking about Topeka radio stations. We have Bill Schaefer, who used to be with Sunflower Journeys and is one of the directors of the Kansas Silent Film Festival, on February 16, talking about old theaters in Topeka. And on March 2, we'll have a program about Nick Childs, who was a Black publisher here in Topeka, publishing The Plain Dealer for many, many years right out of Topeka, Kansas. So those are all free programs that occur on Sunday afternoon at our headquarters building over on, where is it, Bill? Well, it's over on Madison. Yes, sorry, I should have had that, but you know how things go. Anyway, please consider that if you will. We also have our annual meeting on December 8th, and this is at the Topeka Country Club, and that is a luncheon that is $40 per person, featuring our speaker, Diana Carlin Piron, who is going to be talking about U.S. First Ladies, more than the women behind the men. So consider that, and please join us if you're so inclined. But the Historical Society and the library are pleased to have you here this evening for the Menninger Roundtable. And we're really starting the celebration of the centennial for Menninger, which, as Dr. Walt will no doubt explain, didn't happen until next year, but we want to get an early start on it. So that's why we've convened this meeting with some of the folks from Menninger, who will tell us stories and reminisce about their times, their affiliation with that wonderful organization. Now, as all of you probably know, Dr. Roy Menninger passed away on October 24 of this year, and he was an invited speaker for this evening's event. And in fact, I talked to him about his attendance here a couple of days before he passed away, and he was very excited and looking forward to the program, and actually had prepared a paper to present to all of you. And so we think about him for a moment as we begin tonight's program. We're going to start with Dr. Walt Menninger, who's here on my right, and we have Dr. John Allen visiting us from Houston, Dr. Ira Stamm on down the table there, Mr. Dave Parker, and Dr. Marcy Bauman-Bork at the end of the table. But I thought I would get started with a question to Dr. Walt. I've started reading his very interesting book that just came out, Like What You Do. And that's probably great advice for any of us, but I started reading it. And one of the things I found interesting was that Dr. Walt's grandfather, CF, Dr. CF, had visited the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, and was captivated by what they were doing there and wanted to bring that sort of a model back to Topeka. So Dr. Walt, how was it that Dr. CF and his son segued from a general sort of practice to treating those who were suffering from mental illnesses?
You want me to use your,
Or we can use that as well if you prefer.
Well-
Either one. Yeah, there we go.
it was his eldest son. Actually, the grandfather started practice in 1890. He trained in a homeopathic medical school in Chicago, and he knew that was limited in answer, but there weren't a lot of things available to treat people with. They didn't have medications and so forth, and he was constantly interested in continuing education. And he subscribed to journals from Germany and all over, medical journals. But also, on this occasion, he went up to Rochester, Minnesota. And it sounds apocryphal, but the story is that when he got back at the breakfast table the next morning after the prayer, he said, "Boys, I know what we're going to do. When you grow up, you become doctors and come back and we'll establish a clinic in Topeka like the Mayos have in Rochester." Because at that time, there were not medications. The doctors sort of developed their own techniques and were very protective. And he wanted to share and learn from one another. And the middle brother had an accident in college that sent him a different direction in career. But Carl went to Harvard Medical School, and there he was influenced by the professor of psychiatry, Elmer Ernest Southard, who told him, when you go into practice, go back and don't forget the children. And so that's why the children's division of Menninger was named after Dr. Southard. But grandfather said, that's fine. We can still practice together. And so maintained the office initially down on Kansas Avenue. Actually, moved to a different one at one point. But obviously, there was a point at which some of Carl's patients were not managed very well in Stormont and Christ Hospital, who were here. And so they knew they had to get property where they could establish a sanitarium. And the date of the centennial is actually April 1st of 1925 or 2025, because it was April 1st on 1925. They incorporated the Menninger Sanitarium Corporation that they could sell stock to local citizens to fund buying the property on West 6th Street that became the first Menninger Hospital. And it was that aspect that got things started. My father, who was 6 years younger than Carl, thought about being a medical missionary. He trained in medicine and surgery. And the clinic, the sanitarium was started, and Carl called Will and said, "Come home, we need you." And my father was married to my mother on December 12th of 1925, and they drove back here, and Carl gave Dad the responsibility, head sanitarium, and went off to I don't know what. He was a man of many interests. But as things progressed, my father stayed primarily responsible for the clinic, developing in the sanitarium and the program of the sanitarium. The challenge as things evolved was often asked, well, how did Menninger become recognized for what it is? How did it develop the influence that it ultimately had? And it was certainly due to the intellectual challenge or the intellectually challenging character of Carl. Carl was how should you describe it? Because when he was good, he was very, very good. And when he wasn't, Dad was more even-tempered. And Dad, I think, was much more appropriately the director who, in the early days of the sanitarium, helped organize the approach to the patients and developed the treatment. And they established programs to train nurses. And then they got approved for training doctors. And they also, first Carl and then my father, got interested in and went back to Chicago to be trained as psychoanalysts. And they brought psychoanalytic theory and wove it into the treatment process and program at Menninger. And I mean, not all the patients sat on the couch, but it was a matter of understanding what are the motivational forces in people and how do we deal with the conflicts of relationship that they were able to build up a treatment program for, particularly when there were not all these medicines that there are today, or even before the electrical interventions, which first started with shock treatment in the late 30s. But they established an environment that was therapeutic and controlled. They developed training programs, became interested, and Carl then, to what extent, how he fitted in, but Carl wrote down, and he was a masterful conceptualizer of these concepts. And he finished The Human Mind in 1930, which became a bestseller. And I think that's probably what first brought Menninger to public notice. Carl's book was a bestseller popularly, not in terms of just professionals. And he followed it with other books, so that made the Menninger name recognize. Carl was also a contributor to Ladies' Home Journal or something, and the various popular publications. So it made the Menninger name known. And then as the clinic developed and training was carried out, and they attracted patients, and they became recognized as being an excellent place for treatment for people who were emotionally disturbed. In 35, 36, Conroy, what was it, 35 or 36 Fortune? The Fortune magazine article. I think at that time there was an article on psychiatric hospitals that appeared in Fortune magazine. And there were 4 hospitals from the East Coast, east of the Allegheny Mountains, and 1 hospital west, Menninger. And so it became the place that attracted a lot of people, and even from the west, because we were on the Santa Fe Railroad. You could come back. This is before flights and so forth. So that was, you couldn't develop better marketing, I think. But so it developed a reputation. Both in the doctors also started a professional journal known as the Bulletin of the Menninger Clinic. Here was a man who was editor for how many years?
I think about 10.
10 years.
On the board for many more.
Yeah. And it became recognized in the profession. So it gained both popular recognition through Carl's various publications and the work professionally. They established connections with it, and they did a good job. And that led to the expanding appreciation and recognition. There were some other factors that came along in the way that I think contributed to what Menninger ultimately became kind of the influence. In the wars, in the years prior to World War II, there were a lot of psychoanalysts who were forced to leave Europe because of the threat of Hitler, and a lot who were Jewish. And we were able to attract a number of the psychoanalysts to settle in Topeka that helped bring that philosophy and that Weltanschauung, the world outlook, that we were able to establish the first training institute for psychoanalysis west of the Mississippi River, here in Topeka, Kansas, in the, well, it was 39, 40, thereabouts. I think it was 40. But anyway. And so that gave more recognition. Interestingly enough, in those days, a psychoanalytic institute had to be formed with an affiliation or a branch from an existing psychoanalytic institute. And the Topeka Institute was initially a branch of the Chicago Institute, which Carl and my father and others trained. The psychoanalytic institutes in San Francisco and Los Angeles were originally branches of the Topeka Psychoanalytic Institute. And you can credit that to the Santa Fe Railway that allowed the analysts from here to go out to the West Coast and expand in that direction. Some other significant aspects that I think led to what Menninger came to have as influence were certainly early in the 30s. They were approved for training doctors in the specialty of psychiatry and also expanded in training nurses. And so it became a training center some. And early in, I think it was 36, when they then started publishing their papers in the Bulletin of the Menninger Clinic and had a broader influence in the profession. And at the end, during World War II, the country was confronted with the fact that the extent of psychiatric symptoms, I won't say illness, but psychiatric problems, was a major problem in terms of recruiting people into the service, the number of had to, and then casualties from the war. And there weren't enough psychiatrists. And one of the challenges of the military in the beginning of the war was training doctors, what they called them 90-day wonders, to become psychiatrists to help in the war. And the Army, as the war ended, the Veterans Administration realized it had a big problem, that there were going to be all these casualties, and they didn't have the capacity to deal with it. And they came to Topeka. A representative of the head of the VA came to Topeka to talk with Carl about expanding the training of psychiatrists and related disciplines here in Topeka, that they would take over an Army hospital that was known as Winter General and make that a veterans hospital and focus on psychiatry. And Carl, the story, it may be apocryphal, that Carl said, well, we could train maybe 19. And the largest was, I think, 10 out at Bellevue over 3 years there. And the VA said, we don't need 19, we need 100. And indeed, by January of 1946, Carl had been moved over to the VA, organized with the colleagues a program, and there were 100 young doctors in training here in Topeka. Now you can imagine in a town of 40,000 people, 40,000 people, you get an influx of young veterans, highly motivated, and with all the kinds of intellectual interests that young doctors and professionals have, and families that come with them, has its impact on the community. And that program, for a number of years, was the largest training program for psychiatrists in the world. It was up until we decreased and others finally grew, but that became a major influencing factor that again brought recognition to Topeka. These were various elements that I think contributed to this, plus the fact that after the war, my father was thrust into leadership roles in the field of psychiatry. He was on the cover of Time magazine, and he was invited to actually talk to President Kennedy to encourage his support for the Mental Health Services Act to support health clinics. And that all of those, I think, contributed to the impact that the institution was able to develop. And I think I've gone over my time.
Dr. John Allen, you were here in Topeka for many years, and you then transitioned to Houston. Can you tell us about your perspective from both of those locations?
Yes, I will. Thanks. I'm honored to be here. Thanks, Paul, for inviting me. And I will say, for me, this is an occasion for gratitude, really, as I look back to the Menningers and what you started and sustained, and to many who are here who actually contributed to that sustenance. So I'm happy to give my perspective. Actually, as you were talking, Walt, I was thinking my mother knew about Menninger, when I was a kid, because we had neighbors who had a son who was at Menninger. And Carl Menninger came to Connecticut. I grew up in Connecticut, and Carl Menninger came to give a talk in the adjacent town. I wish I knew what year it was, but she heard him. And so Menninger was on our family's mind. And when I applied to the postdoc at Menninger, she was just delighted. And she moved to Topeka in her old age, and Dr. Carl met with her and talked with her. So this was a wonderful, signed a book, Sparks signed it for her. So Menninger was, on the radar long before I arrived there. And I think it's kind of interesting, my timeline. If I can squeeze, if you'll allow me to round up a couple of years, my career at Menninger was a half century. So I was in the half century, the latter half of this century that we're celebrating. And I came at 1976 to Menninger. And then for that half century, about half of it was in Topeka, and the other half of it was in Houston. So this is a kind of nice symmetry, really. And I retired in 2016 from the staff, but I continued to be involved up through October of this year. So I have a sense of the present, even though I retired in 2016, continued to teach and supervise and consult and so forth. So I was involved with the move. I will say we were very ambivalent about moving to Texas, but we moved, and we're very glad that we did it. It's been a wonderful career to me, these two halves of this half century. It was quite a wild situation to send patients down on an airplane and to transport this whole institution from Topeka to Houston. And when I came to Menninger, it was a long-term psychoanalytic hospital, which was rare in those days and non-existent really in these days. But patients would stay for a year. Some patients stayed for a number of years, and it was psychoanalytic, as Walt has been saying. So with managed care, the lengths of stay decreased as insurance coverage was required. And so when we moved to Houston, the length of stay was condensed from 1 year plus to several weeks. So we had the kind of a 6 to 8 week time frame was the hospitalization that was developed in Topeka and then moved to Houston. So this was, for somebody with a long career there, this was quite a shocking change. And I will say that I was skeptical that this institution could be moved. It's like putting it all in a paint shaker and sending it away and see what happens. One of my colleagues in Houston said that those of us who went down, is around 80, I think, roughly, who went down from Topeka, were like the yeast. And so it's a good metaphor because we literally had to recreate what had been developed in Topeka and try to get it going in Houston with this new shorter length of stay. And the education programs, the research programs had been discontinued. And the whole continuum of care beside the hospital was discontinued so that it could be moved. So we had to regrow all of that in Houston, and we did. I mean, we recreated the full educational programs. The residents, psychiatric residents, had moved down there, but all the social work, psychology, nursing, all of that had to be recreated, and the research had to be recreated. Not to mention trying to get the clinical care going in a way that, was comparable to Topeka. And when we moved there, amazingly, the census went way up. I mean, we were, I guess you could say, flooded with patients, and we had to recruit all these new staff members to work there. And the people who came to work there, to them, this kind of treatment we were doing was weird. You would, like for nurses, the nurses came, they thought patients did what you told them to do. And this just didn't work this way. So, and it was a very psychologically oriented treatment that we were doing. So there was a lot of turnover in all the disciplines, and it took quite a while to get a stable staff going. But that did happen. Now, my career at Menninger, for me, this was such a wonderful place to work because I wanted to do clinical work, but I had an academic background in orientation. So I was doing research and teaching in the universities when I was in Topeka, but I was involved in a lot of clinical research and research on how effective the treatment was. And we did a lot of research on the effectiveness of treatment, but it was kind of patchy in Topeka. So I was curious, well, how is this thing working here? And so after 5 years there, I led the development of an outcomes program, which for the first time in the history of the clinic was universal assessment of all patients at admission, every 2 weeks, and discharge. And then we gave feedback to the patients about their progress and to the staff. And we did a lot of research and publishing a lot of what we were learning about this. So, and then later in that project, follow-up was instituted, a year follow-up. And we found that the the gains were stable over that period. And I will tell you that we were surprised by the dramatic improvement. Now, obviously, there's a lot of variation among patients, but on the whole, the improvement was dramatic and it was sustained. So this was very reassuring to me, having, moved and wondering how is this working? Well, it was working. So I was pleased to find that out, needless to say. So those are numbers. Okay. But let me tell you just a few anecdotes, which in a way mean more, I think, than all the numbers. We had, by the way, over 1,000 patients, data on over 1,000 patients. So this was pretty robust. That's the benefit of short stays. You can get, if you want a lot of data, you're not going to get it with years-long stays. So a few markers for me, and this is quite recent years. This was after I retired but remained engaged. I went to a graduation event, and what I heard from the graduates sounded just like the old days. I mean, they were so thankful that they had come. They were especially grateful to their mentors, all they learned from the people who trained them and mentored them. And I can tell you, it sounded no different from what you would have heard in the early days, which to me was very compelling. Another thing, and this was very recently, the patients in Houston, I can't remember, Houston, Topeka, what. The patients in Houston had formed an alumni group, and they stayed in touch after they had discharged. And they came back, and this was a couple months ago, actually. They came back for a reunion at Menninger. I think it might have been with this 100th vibe. And I was invited to come and talk about hope, which was something that was, that was a major theme at Menninger. And so I came and talked to them. And again, these patients were so grateful. The patient who organized it happened to have been my therapy patient. And she had come and was very suicidal, made a serious attempt. And what I heard again was gratitude. There's so much gratitude for each other and for what the Menningers started. And again, this was not different in any way I can discern from the kind of experience that we had with patients in Kansas. And then another thing, this was in October. I for years after I left, I was doing a kind of introductory seminar for the incoming fellows. And so I would meet with them 4 sessions and kind of introduce them to the Menninger ethos, as I thought about it. And again, these fellows, this was just October, a month ago. They were so enthusiastic about coming to Menningers and learning about Menningers. And it was just, they just ate it up. It was just wonderful and encouraging. So we have the numbers and then those experiences that I am convinced that this transition was successful. It was a huge loss for Topeka and people who, did not make the transition. But I think it really shows that what was developed to sustain it, the move was deemed to be necessary. And I'm convinced that it really was sustained in a very different form from when I started. And when I retired in 2016, I was reflecting on what my experience at Menninger, what it meant to me. And what I realized was that it was not what we learned cognitively, really, that was most important. What was most valuable was the quality of the people who were there. It was the quality of the people who were there. And I think, I'm thinking of staff members, but I can tell you, I would also include the patients. Nothing would have happened without patients who, devoted their energy and their being to getting the care. And Len Horwitz was a psychologist he was the psychologist who recruited me to come onto the staff. And I stayed in touch with him. He lived to be 99. I stayed in touch with him to, really up until the time at the end of his life. And I was saying to him at one point, it was the people, the quality of the people, not so much whether it's psychoanalysis or this technique or that technique. And he said, you're not giving the institution enough credit. And I think it was a very good point that the quality of the people was nurtured and shaped by the institution. And I think, that goes way back before my time. I think, and I was the beneficiary of that as well.
I call it the Menninger virus.
Yeah, and I call it the yeast, which has a bit of a different kind of connotation. So, and consistent with that, what's really important, you can just read this quote. It was included in this handout. Irv Rosen was another master psychologist. We wanted him to come down to Houston to do a graduation address, and he was not able to do it in person, so he did a video, which was played a number of years. But this is so beautiful. He said, the techniques that characterize a clinic at any given time are ephemeral, provisional to be replaced by newer methodologies. What forms the core of the place are its values of hope, caring, sustained by a spirit of ever-present inquiry. So it's the values of the people that are crucial. And I've written 2 books. It's in my retirement in quotes. And the field of psychotherapy is really crazy. A lot of you might not know, there are hundreds of brands of psychotherapy that have been developed. Hundreds of brands of therapy. It's absurd that we have so many brands of therapy when the research shows over a half decade or more that it's the quality of the therapeutic relationship that really determines the outcome, contributes most to it. So I've been writing these last 2 books. I'm making the point, we need to shift the balance from developing more and more therapies to the development of therapists. And I realized only in the last day that what I've been writing about came from what I'm saying, that it's the people. It's the people. And that point about developing therapists, it fits with what Irv has said and what I learned from being there. So that's my piece.
Well, Dr. Ira Stam, you wanted to share your reminiscences of Menninger and its time in Topeka. So we have a brief PowerPoint from Dr. Stam that you'll be able to watch on the screens. It's a little awkward. It's not up front, it's to the side, but please draw your attention there, and Dr. Stam will share with you what he has. Thank you.
Are we on? Can you hear me? Before we begin, I'm curious, I'm sure others, how many in the room have worked at Menninger? Michelle, you don't have to raise your hand. How many of you are part of a family or connected to Menninger by marriage or parenthood? Okay. How many of you know the person you're sitting next to? Okay. If you don't, please turn to them now and introduce yourselves just quickly. Oh, thank you. Okay. It's an honor and a privilege to be here. So many familiar faces, new faces. Each of us has our own way of honoring Menninger. This is my version. I've called this Miracles on 6th Street, borrowed from, daily that happened on 6th Street, borrowed from my favorite Christmas story, Miracles on 34th Street. So thank you. The Menninger story, my time was 1972 to 1975. I have a bunch of slides to begin with, and then we will share the printed part of the talk. I picked that up somewhere, that beautiful depiction of what patients must experience and go through. Next, from the Menninger perspective, okay. What does that say? I need to get closer. That's the Menninger Clinic building. Oh, Walt. Oh, that's the southern one. Okay, let me get closer. The southern building and school. It says what? 1927. Next, please. Help me get this right. Dr. Carl CF and Dr. Will.
Right.
Did I get that right?
Yes.
Okay. That's my effort years ago to do the genogram. Okay, next. Tower building. This was meant to be by way of warm up, get us into the sense of connection. Next, okay. Next. That's Dr. Carl riding his horse on the grounds of near the stables, not far from where the tennis courts and the swimming pool used to be. Those of you who were here last time heard the brief story on Family Day at Menninger. Joanna and I and our young daughters and others were taken on a hayride on the campus there where Dr. Carl used to ride that horse. Do you know the horse's name, Walt? No?
No,
Actually, I had thought someone needs to do a brief write-up we have on the history of horses at Menninger. Okay, because there were barns and so on. Anyway, the person driving the hay wagon said Dr. Carl was riding his horse there. The horse passed away directly under him. Dr. Carl asked or ordered that the horse's remains be buried on the spot, which happened. I assume this is a true story. Fast forward, when Security Benefit Life attained the building, the grounds south of 6th Street, I sent Howard Fricke, the CEO of Security Benefit Life. I said, look, you should know that the remains of Dr. Carl's horse are buried there. Please talk with your contractor and excavators, and when they're digging the grounds for the new building, see if you come up with that. I never heard back from Howard. Walt, is that a true story? Have you heard that one before? There are a lot of...
I can neither affirm nor deny.
Next, Katie, next. That's the clinic building, 1925. I would add to Dr. Walt's comments that in those days, patients were admitted under cloak of darkness because in that time people were not too copacetic about mental health patients coming to Topeka. Is that the version you heard?
I never wrote that.
That, okay, so it was done. Anyway, next, Katie. Okay. These words spoken by Dr. Carl. The meaning of the modern hospital is quite different. It is no longer an asylum, no longer a pest house, no longer a hotel on the way to God. It is a beacon, a lighthouse, and for all its scenes of suffering, it is a place of joy. It is a place in which people come not to die, but to cease dying, a place in which to get well. Next, please. Temporary refuge it may be, and in another sense from the original, truly a hotel of God, a way station, not on the way to death, but on the way to life. Dr. Carl spoke those words at the dedication of the C.F. Menninger Hospital on May 8th, 1954. Next, please. Okay, in 2001, author Jim Collins wrote a popular book called Good to Great, How Companies Went from Good to Great. I've borrowed from that title and extended it from good to great and beyond, meaning the Menninger Clinic. How did it go from good to great? And these are some of my views and ideas. Menninger values and attributes: kindness and compassion towards patients and staff. Menninger consisted of bright thinkers and good-hearted people, such as the people in this room. 2, all staff are equal and valued equally and treated with respect, no matter their education, degree, or background. 3, Menninger began and was for most of its history a family business. The Menninger mantra might have been, our family taking care of your family. The Menninger leaders and family took good care of the Menninger staff, who in turn took good care of the Menninger patients. I use the word love advisedly. There was a lot of love, caring for each other and caring for the patients. Everyone cared about everyone else. It was not all paradise. There were difficult moments and times, but generally it was kindness, concern, and caring. And then lastly, common sense, judgment, and wisdom. Menninger staff had excellent common sense and good judgment, sprinkled with much wisdom. It was not uncommon in a staff meeting or patient review for a child care worker or mental health technician to say to the doctor, "Doctor, I think you are missing the point or making a mistake." And for the doctor to reply, "Thank you for bringing that up and calling it to my attention. I was wrong and I need to change my understanding and approach." Am I blocking you? Can you see? Okay, next, please. More about the Menninger values and understanding. Sometimes the start of the patient's treatment or the first meaningful connection the patient makes with staff may be with the employee who serves the patient his or her plate of food on the cafeteria line, or the employee who cleans the patient's room or helps the patient to make their bed. Simple acts of kindness pave the way to a deeper interpersonal connection and therapeutic progress. That's a paraphrase of the words of Dr. Peter Novotny, a distinguished psychiatrist and psychoanalyst. Next, please, thank you. The right place at the right time. I feel fortunate to have trained and worked at Menninger for 23 years. I feel fortunate to have been assigned initially to the 1 South unit of the adult hospital, led during my time by Douglas Schaefer, MD, and then Robert Oburn, MD. When I turned to my left or turned to my right, I was surrounded by staff smarter, brighter, kinder, and more compassionate than I. The staff of One South included psychiatrist Frank Chesky, William Robinson, Lee Johnson, social workers Dave Parker, who's here with us, Nolan Broha, Alma Katz, psychologist William Smith, section nurse Harriet Miller, Darlene Jackson, mental health technician, and numerous activities therapists, nurses, mental health technicians. In the Children's Hospital, the primary staff for most years were child care workers. Next, please. Menninger, the golden years, what made the difference? In my studies of leadership in companies that succeed, struggle, or fail, one factor seems to make the difference. The personal issues and temperament of individual staff did not interfere with the common goals of treatment. The mantra of One South and throughout Menninger was and still is, we are all in this together. Our task is to combine our collective intellect and personal traits to help our patients. We can disagree with each other and resolve our differences, but always to the benefit of the patient. To paraphrase Professor Harold Hill from The Music Man, personal narcissism is the devil's playground. Okay. And next, other elements of the Menninger success story. Education, education, education. Menninger was awash in training programs and continuing education in psychiatry, psychology, social work, family therapy, psychoanalysis, the clergy, nursing, activities therapy, etc. There was the summer CE program on medical marriages at Crested Butte, Colorado, led by Drs. Royce and Gabbard, the Colorado River seminars for business executives, and the stirring debates on the role of women at work and at home. Dr. Roy routinely sent Menninger staff to the A.K. Rice Tavistock Group Relations conferences in cities across the country, as well as in Topeka. A speaker once commented that at the national level, mental health tends to practice psychotheology rather than psychotherapy. At Menninger, Dr. Erwin Rosen, whose task was to assign each Menninger patient to a Menninger therapist, used to say and teach, quotes, there is no such thing as an untreatable patient. The challenge is to find and match each patient with the right therapist. Next, please. Personal therapy and psychoanalysis. There was no shortage of opportunities for staff to pursue their own personal therapy and/or psychoanalysis. There is the story of Dr. Carl serving as a consultant at a Menninger diagnostic case conference. After the presenter and Dr. Carl made their comments, Dr. Carl invited discussion from the audience. Silence, and more silence, and more silence. Finally, a brave soul in the back of the room raised his hand and said, Dr. Carl, the reason no one in this room is talking is because 1/3 of the therapists in this room are in therapy with the second third of therapists in the room who are being supervised by the third group of therapists in the room. Walt, is that true or is that? But anyway, next comment. Okay. Lastly, Menninger's success may be because it combined world-class mental health treatment within a micro-university setting located in a small town, kind of like in a monastic setting. And that's why the founding Your Relatives came from Chicago to Topeka. They wanted a small setting where the doctors would not be distracted by the big city lights or something like that. Menninger was adjacent to other first-rate clinical settings, which Dr. Walt has described, such as Topeka VA, Topeka State Hospital, the Youth Center at Topeka, the Adult and Child and Family Community Mental Health Centers, and so on. In 1972, when my wife Joanna and I came to Topeka for the first time, we were greeted on I-70 at the McVicker exit by these words, "Welcome to Topeka, psychiatric capital of the world." I've been looking all over for a picture of that billboard, if anyone has it. I've checked the newspapers. I haven't been to the Historical Society yet. And then finally, thank you, Menninger, for all you have given to Joanna and myself and our family. But more importantly, to the clients and their families you have entrusted to our care. Thank you.
Mr. Dave Parker, you were on staff for about 30 years, and you did not make the transition or decide to go to Houston. What are your reminiscences about your time here in Topeka as a social worker?
I've had the privilege of working with everyone on this panel except Dr. Walt. But I lived at 15th and McVicker, and he lived directly behind me. And my fondest memory of Dr. Walt was one day I was at church at Holy Name, and there was a windstorm that came through Topeka. It was almost like a hurricane, but it was just in central Topeka. I came home, walked in my house, and a limb from a tree in front of my house went through a double pane window and was in my bedroom. Dr. Walt and Connie, his wife, were there cleaning it up. That speaks to the kind of neighbors that they were. I came here in 1970 after being in the Air Force as a social worker for 3 years. My experience was great in the Air Force, but I learned what I didn't know, that I needed more training to be a good social worker. So I chose the postmaster's program at Menninger. I was assigned to a long-term treatment unit and the outpatient diagnostic service. Like Ira and John, we both at one time were on the Schaefer section. So we were very fortunate in that regards. When I started, the adult hospital had just 4 long-term units and 1 short-term. It was a diagnostic and treatment unit where people would stay a couple months. In the diagnostic service, let me go back. Like Ira has said, and he's kind of taken half my talk. You can't help but be impressed by the team effort. Just like it takes a village to raise a child, it takes a team of people to have successful treatment. And it isn't just professional staff. One time we had a problem with our secretary on the unit was related so well to the patients, there was a little jealousy developed. It was like she had a better relationship than some of the other staff members did. And treatment wasn't always easy. We would get battles between the floor staff, the nursing staff, and the off-floor staff as to who had the harder job, and were we being supportive enough? And also, we were well-staffed, but we would have meetings about a particular patient. And if you can imagine, if you had 12 children and maybe 20 parents, to how to decide what the rules were going to be or how you were going to treat that child. That's what it was like. But there was also many, many advantages. I would see the support staff, and I'm including the whole staff, is like the military can't function without non-commissioned officers. We couldn't have done what we did without the support staff. For years, I was in an every other week Thursday night poker group We would play poker, and then we would have breakfast at the old truck stop at 11:30. We probably were useless the next day, but we had fun. One night, someone raised the question, if you had to start Menningers from scratch and had to pick 10 people who were presently on staff, who would you pick? We went around the room and picked people. And it was really interesting because several of us picked Lee Patterson, who was the secretary in the outpatient and diagnostic service. That we had so much respect for her. In the diagnostic service, we would do outpatient psychiatric evaluations, but were very comprehensive. So people came here from all over. Well, initially it was 2 weeks, and then we shortened it to a week, where they would have an examining psychiatrist or psychologist, a social worker who would work with the family. We would have a internist who would do a medical exam. We had very comprehensive psychological testing. And we also would have a consultant who would meet with us, and this would be a senior clinician. And this was true both in the diagnostic service and the hospital. One of the things we had benefited from was having an outside opinion by an expert who also was a staff member. So it worked very well. One of the things that was interesting for me, because the initial interview would be the social worker, whatever family came, and the identified patient. And so I saw a number of psychiatrists, and at one time the residents used to rotate through the service. So I was present when they would interview, and then also the last interview I would be there too. But anyway, what I was struck by is how people have different approaches and different ways of interviewing, but the end result could be the same, which was very encouraging to me. You know, when you think of a therapist, you know, you think of a particular type. There's many types of approaches and many therapists. Most of my time on the West Campus, Dr. Roy Menninger was the president of the foundation, and periodically he would have all staff meetings. And Dr. Roy was a very good and polished speaker. I saw his meetings, it's like Menninger's State of the Union message. And Dr. Roy was not doing a lot of clinical work, and so he volunteered at one point to take some work in the diagnostic service. So I had the privilege of working on a case with him. And it was really interesting sitting in with him because, again, he was different, but he was more direct than a lot of the other therapists, but equally good. After the evaluation, as is typical, the examining therapist will write a letter to the referring doctor. Well, Dr. Roy had his secretary call me on the phone and say, Dr. Roy's sending this letter. Do you have any additions or corrections? And believe me, being the low man on the totem pole, I can't tell you how flattered I felt that he was that considerate and took the time to do that.
You aren't saying whether you had any additions or corrections.
Dr. Roy also had a sense of humor, as does Dr. Walt. But every spring, one of the Menninger traditions is they would honor employees who had been there 5 years or longer. And at every 5-year interval, a group would choose someone to speak to the crowd. Okay, and I was chosen one year, and it just happened to be a year where Menninger's was having some financial problems, and they weren't able to give salary raises. And being honored, you also got it used to be that you would get an actual gift that you would order out of a catalog, and then later it became money depending on how long you had been there. But anyway, my first year at Menninger's, I remember going in the old Hopkins gym and seeing all these things on the wall, and there was a note that said that I forget who it was, or one of our senior administrators, they gave him like a round the world trip. Now, maybe I'm exaggerating, but that's how I remember. but anyway, when I was talking for my group, I said, well, you know, the way we're doing financially, I'll be lucky if they send me to Oskaloosa. Dr. Roy was sitting right in front of me, and if I read his lips correctly, he said, one way. Over the years, Menningers began to target treatment units to address specific problems. As I said, initially we had 4 long-term units, 1 short-term unit. In time, we developed an alcohol and drug unit, and Dr. Conroy was one of my bosses, he's here tonight. We had a eating disordered unit. We had a unit for professionals in crisis, including at one point we had a contract with the NFL where they would send some of their athletes here. Under the guidance of Dr. Larry Kennedy, Menninger developed a very comprehensive day hospital program. Initially, day hospital was more of just a status on paper. It really wasn't a program. But Dr. Kennedy helped develop halfway houses. We had a supervised apartment living program, and a number of patients lived with families in Topeka. It was called our Family Living Program. It was a very successful program. The second half of my career was spent off campus at the Menninger Community Service Office at 3rd and Kansas. And later I went to the outpatient clinic at 37th and Burlingame. These clinics were quite different from what I was used to on the West Campus. On the West Campus, most of our patients had a very good insurance and maybe came from a wealthy family. Not everyone, but quite a few did. And they came from all over the country. The community service office was on a sliding fee scale, and our clientele was much more economically and racially diverse. In some respects, I felt like I had just moved to Topeka as a social worker because for the first time, I was aware of services that the community had to offer for people with problems. I was fortunate to be able to do group therapy and to work in our employee assistance program, where we had contracts with a number of businesses in town where their employees could get 3 free counseling sessions with us. And it was a great program because we were dealing with people who necessarily didn't have serious emotional problems, but had something that they needed a little bit of a different opinion. One of my most unique cases was a guy who came in one day, and his problem was his dog had died, and the dog was cremated, and he wanted to know where he should bury the dog. Well, as I talked to him, what was really interesting about this is this dog had been with him through many important phases of his life. He had been divorced, his parents died, he changed jobs, a number of transitions. And the death of the dog, I think, brought back a lot of things that he hadn't totally dealt with. What he ended up doing, which I thought was kind of interesting, he put the ashes in different places, and every place represented something in his life. One of the things that really kept me going was to see the strength and resiliency of the people, of the clients or patients that I worked with. Dr. Bill Tarnar told a friend, Tarnar was a psychiatrist here at Menningers, and he was supervising a friend of mine. And he told my friend one day in a session, you can learn from your patients, and they can teach you something. They have strengths. And that certainly proved to be the case in my experience. I once had a woman who, didn't have great economic resources, didn't have much family support, but she knew so much about what was available in Topeka for her that if I ever taught a course at Washburn, I'd bring this lady to my class to teach the class because she knew more about these resources than I did, and I was the professional. I had another patient, this is one of my favorites. He had been hospitalized at Topeka State 20 times, and he had an alcohol problem, and he also was schizoaffective, which was kind of a form of schizophrenia. Well, he eventually achieved sobriety. And so during the course of being with me, he was out of the hospital for a year. And in celebration, I bought him a Coca-Cola. And it was interesting because he picked up on that. And after that, at every year anniversary of his being out of the hospital, he would invite his friends to a local McDonald's for a little party. Okay, and this same patient, one week was having a temptation to drink, and he knew if he drank, that would do him in. So what did he do? He called up Barry Feeker at the rescue mission. Now, he had been at the mission in his past, so he knew Barry. And he asked Barry Feeker if he could spend the weekend there. And Barry, who was so compassionate, let him do it. And the crisis passed. And this is not a criticism of the West Campus, but if he'd been on the West Campus, he would have been admitted to our crisis unit, and he'd probably been there 10 days, and it would have cost someone a lot of money. Unfortunately, we built our complex on the hill at a time when, or shortly before, mental health, inpatient mental health, drastically changed in this country. I think it changed for a couple reasons. One being that there was so many for-profit short-term psychiatric hospitals and alcohol and drug units. In Topeka alone, I think that at one time there was 4 inpatient alcohol treatment units. And insurance companies developed managed care as if they were saying enough's enough. Okay, and it was not easy to deal with them, but that caused a big shift in how we did care. I think Menninger's adjusted as best it could, and I wished we had stayed in Topeka. I feel better after talking to John about Houston because I had no idea how it turned out.
Good.
So it's that's kind of the part of the story I needed to hear. But can you imagine what it would be like if you taught at Washburn for 30 years and Washburn decided to move to Houston, okay? And the campuses are there and some of the buildings are torn down, but there's no people around. So, that has been, it's getting better, but when I retired, that was hard for me to deal with. It's the fact that, I couldn't walk into a place at work in my Bermuda shorts and tell the people there I'm going golfing, They weren't there. They were gone to Houston. But let me just conclude by saying I feel very honored to be a part of this panel and have the opportunity to share these memories. Thank you.
Dr. Marcy Baumann-Bork, John Allen told us that about 80 people went to Houston, staff people, but there were many, including yourself, who decided to stay here and to continue on in a different format under a different umbrella. Can you tell us, you were a founder of one of those organizations. Can you tell us what that organization is and how that's worked out?
Okay. Needless to say, all of these are tough acts to follow. I do want to say one little quip before I launch into what we did with Heritage Mental Health as of 2001 when Menninger actually left. The thing that I want to echo that others have raised today is how grateful I've been and will always be for having trained at Menninger. I remember so well when I was on my pediatric rotation in medical school. And I was really pretty naive about psychiatry, but a psychoanalyst from South Africa was there at Nebraska, and he came up to me and he said, "You belong at Menninger." And I thought, I've got to figure out what this means. And so after I had interviewed in internal medicine and clinical pathology, my last interview was to interview in psychiatry, and I got to meet with Dr. Walt. And my interview with him was so different than any other interview for any other type of residency. And I'll always remember, Dr. Walt, you said, "I want to know who you are." Nobody else had ever said anything about who are you. They were much more interested in what I was willing to do for the program. And it was deeply flattering, Dr. Walt, that you wanted to know who I was. And you also were interested that I had a husband that was coming with me. And that's the story that brought us to Topeka. And I joke with people that I'm on year 41 of my 4-year residency. Still here. So just briefly, what I did before Menninger left me. I was lucky enough to be in a lot of different aspects of what Menninger offered in treatment. I did some time on the long-term unit. I did some time at Children's Division. I was on the Professionals in Crisis unit. I got to be the residency director for 5 years, and then I became the medical director at Menninger Outpatient Center at Burlingame. When they left in 2001, I thought, what am I going to do? Because at that point, much to our surprise, we found out we had another child on the way, and my job was ending. Dr. Roy said, "You should talk to Kay Kelly. She's talking about starting a clinic here." And so Kay Kelly and I got together, and she was amazing. I give her full credit. We did work together to get Heritage Mental Health started. There were 14 of us that I think, wasn't it 14 or 13? I can't remember, something like that. We had people like Dave Blakely was another one of the psychiatrists, and Deb Steinberg. We had Tony Bram and Sid Frieswick as psychologists. Mel Berg was there. We had Sue Crum as one of the social workers.
Use the mic.
Pardon?
Use the mic.
Oh, can you not hear me? Oh, I'm so sorry. You're so lucky. Yeah, so we had psychologists, 3 psychiatrists, the social workers. We had a really nice group. And I'll never forget, somebody from Topeka came up to me and said, "You know what, if Menninger can't make it here, you guys will never make it here." Dr. Roy said, "Don't believe it. You guys will do fine." We had Dr. Roy as a consultant for quite a while. We were very lucky that way. Tony Bram and Kay were very interested in trying to keep education going. You can imagine at a time when we didn't have any backdrop that was really hard to keep going, but we did for a while. And so so that was in 2001. Now we're on year 2024, so we've been going for 23 years. We've been very lucky in having quite a few stay. We've also had some people join us. I'm now down to the last Menninger person at Heritage, which is very sad for me. What makes me smile, though, is lots of times when new people come to me, I'll say, "How did you find me?" And they said, "Oh, I just Googled somebody from Menninger." So they're still looking for somebody that has that background. And it has been amazing to be able to, that's where we came up with the name, right, Kay? We're Heritage Mental Health because we wanted to carry forward what we all had learned at Menninger. There's such a need in the community, and we keep trying to figure out how can we keep going, how can we keep this perspective of trying to figure out who people are and not just focus on medications, trying to keep that perspective going. I'm so glad to hear what John Allen had to share. I'm glad that it was so successful down there. I really did feel very left when you left, when Menninger went down there. But we've been very fortunate in being able to continue forward. I guess, I think I see Alice Eberhardt right here. I don't know if I remember being a child fellow. I remember some of the clinical stories you told. It's just fun to see faces out there. Everybody had something that I learned something from. And that has been such an amazing opportunity. When I think about my life since we came here, we joined the church we joined because that's where Irv Jansen was from the church, from the children's division. We've joined a lot of different organizations because that's where other Menninger people were. That has become kind of the ground that we've walked on the whole time. So it's with a great deal of gratitude that I say thank you to Dr. Walt and everybody else that taught me something. Everybody's taught me a lot, including Nurse Scott from the PIC unit. Yeah, so from there, I'll just kind of turn this back to everybody. If I have to guess, there's some other questions. One thing that somebody had raised with me today, just real quick, they said, do you remember doing grand searches back in the day? And I think back to how much Menninger must have cared that we would go looking for somebody if they left the hospital. We don't do that. That was an amazing experience, going all over the community looking for somebody. It just captures something about each individual person that came into those walls were very, very important. So with that, I will turn this back to Paul. Did I cover it?
You did.
I'd just like to make a comment that my brother dearly wanted to be here. He remained very sharp. Some of you may not know that the condition he had was a gradual deterioration of the muscle fibrils in the voluntary muscles. And so he was essentially physically paralyzed. He had a chair he could manipulate about by pushing his thumb and his forefinger and so forth. But he remained interested in everything and everybody, both in his, he had a reading group that he met with regularly at Grace Episcopal, and they Zoomed in later times, and in many other respects. And he would have loved to have the reminiscences and recollections that are being expressed tonight. And I convey a thank you on his behalf of your concerns about that.
Walt, I brought along a copy of Dr. Roy and Dr. Gabbitt's book that they edited on medical marriages. Do you want to say a word? And if anyone, I'll be up here, anyone wants to take a look and scan through it, it'll be here. But do you want to say anything about it?
Not particularly. I know the only thing I will say this is a result of over 3 years of working with a very talented writer that captures many of the thoughts and other issues going along. It's a memoir like what you do, and a picture that is many years ago.
All right, I want to thank the panelists, and we do have a little time for Katie, do we? Questions? Are we good? We have 5 minutes, and we were going to take written questions, but I see hands coming up. So if you would find a microphone or come up here and I'll give you a microphone, we'll take your questions. Sure, that's great.
Oh, okay.
Hi, this is directed to Mr. Allen. I understand there's in April and May, there's commemorations for the 100 years in Houston and here. Do you have more details about any of that? Is there any, has that formulated enough where we can kind of have an idea of when and where and things like that? I'd really be interested to know what you...
Yeah, I don't really know any details. I just saw it. The dates are there. I think you could Google it. Oh, yeah.
So May 2nd, oh, I don't need that. Thank you. May 2nd at Town Site, downtown Topeka. 6 to 9 p.m. is a mixer, so people will just need to buy tickets. That's all it is. There'll be hors d'oeuvres, cash bar. It's just so people can get together and chat. The following day at Sunflower Foundation is an educational day. So I think watch the Menninger Clinic Houston page. And then also, Dr. Walt also has a Facebook page, and we'll post on that too. And you'll have to get him online through the Menninger Clinic Houston.
There is going to be a big do down in Houston in the summer of 25.
All right. So, I want to make a comment, if that's okay. Well, there was a brief mention about the children's department. It was actually deserving more of than a brief thing. It was a 62-bed facility devoted to children and adolescents. It provided all kinds of research and development in terms of the treatment of children and adolescents, which is a very different kind of thing. We had a preschool program that had national recognition. The Southern School provided worldwide training in dealing with learning disability things. There was, the whole kind of thing was different. The adult hospital was divided by diagnosis, and children and adolescents, it was divided by age. The adult psychiatrist needed to know a lot about diagnosis. Children and adolescents had to learn a lot about development and how people progressed through various developmental stages. And each of the units was divided in such a way to address those issues. We could say a lot more, but I just wanted to let people know that in addition to the overwhelming emphasis of the adult, that there was a very vibrant, vital part that dealt with another aspect of thing. When the doctor said, go back and don't forget the children, they didn't. And I didn't want you to think that Menningers had forgotten about the children.
No, it was Carl's professor of psychiatry in Harvard, who when Carl talked about whether he should stay and practice in the East, and Carl decided to come back and join his father and practice in Kansas. And Southard said, don't forget the children. And they didn't.
I wanted y'all to know that.
Maybe I should add, yes, thank you for that, because I worked in the adult system, and there is a children's unit, adolescent unit at Menninger in Houston, and it's they also did a very substantial research project there and contributed a lot. So thank you for that.
Seeing all of you many of you brings back some very fond memories. And one thing that I remember is, John, you're in the wrong place. Because we would have these staff meetings, as Ira kind of talked about, and there were 250 people out there in the Sealy Auditorium. And the director would say, okay, does anybody have any questions? And then, John Allen, have you considered all the consequences of this decision? I've thought about this, and these are some of the possibilities. And it was amazing, the input that came that followed your often brilliant recommendations about changes and programs and different things. So my name's Gary Napier, by the way, and my wife Verna and I went to Houston for 5 years. I went down as director of education, helped move all the certifications for all the providerships there to Houston. And so Verna and I were sitting early on there in one of the meetings, and Dick Munich was directing at that point, and he said, now we want to do this, this, and this. Any questions? John Allen. Now, I've thought about this. Now, have you considered the possible consequences of this decision? And I felt it's going to work with people like John here and the culture that has been created so that the virus or the yeast can grow. Because there is a culture that was being grown there in addition to the virus and the yeast. Thank you all. It's wonderful to hear from you tonight.
My concern, as we were going through the process of negotiating the move and all that, my concern was how can we transplant the ethos of Menninger, which I call, how could we transplant that virus down into the metropolitan polyglot of Houston? But with yours and John's and that issue, we did it. And it's been my privilege to continue to consult down there. I continue to be on the board of the Menninger Clinic. And Texas has all kinds of other limitations and problems and challenges, the state regulations, but the institution survives.
And I should take a minute or two to make up for the omission about the children's division and tell a quick vignette as quickly as I can about the children's hospital.
Please, go ahead.
First of all, that was Les Latoul, one of the many talented social workers in the children's division. In my 23 years at Menningers, I spent 8 years as a unit director of a co-ed unit in the children's hospital, 11 teenagers, 14 to 18 years of age, and that's an education and a half for another time. One evening I'm at home on a Sunday evening, 8 o'clock, settling in. I get a call from the unit, Dr. Stam, we have a situation, can you come on down? One of the blessings about life in Topeka, no matter where you are, you're just 12 minutes away from the hospital. This was in the children's hospital, in the building, the Bonnie Phillips building. There were 4 units. One was Sunrise Hall. It was built as a railroad flat. In other words, you came into the dining room, went through the door to the unit, which was usually locked, not always. And to your left were the patient rooms, and to the right was the wall and nursing station, kind of like here. This was the middle corridor. The rooms were a couple of doubles, a couple of singles, and 1 triple. As I come through the room, I'm surprised by what I witnessed. On one side of the room were half a dozen childcare workers, nurses, standing with their backs to the wall. On the other side were another 6 to 8 childcare workers. What's the crisis? I thought the house was on fire. Dr. Stam, there are 3 teenage girls in the triple room. They are smoking cigarettes, but in all the rooms, I'm an expert now when I visit hospitals, all the furniture, the desks and the bed were movable, and they had barricaded themselves in the room with all the furniture against the door, and they would not come out. What's the crisis? Well, this is when, thankfully, Roy had sent us to group relations conference to train us for this, because half the group on this side said, Dr. Stam, these kids need to come out. It's 8, 9 o'clock at night. We cannot let teenagers take over the unit and tell us what to do. The other half said, what's the trouble? What's the crisis? They're teenage girls. It's 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock. We'll wait them out. They'll get tired, and they'll need to go to the bathroom, and so on. So this is where you wish you had the wisdom of Solomon, but since I don't, what do I do? My instinct was to wait him out, you know, and so on. But fortunately, since I'm not Solomon, I called Dr. Solomon in the name of Joanne Myers, who was director of the hospital, and she took the call. And I said, Joanne, what should we do? And she said, I'm inclined to follow your instinct just to wait them out. So I go back to the staff and I said, Joanne and I had talked about this. This is our strategy. So we wait for a while and they still won't come out. So we talked some more with Joanne and someone came up with the idea, why don't you call the fire department? Good idea. So I called, there I am on the phone with the fire department. I described the situation. They said, Ira, Dr. Stam will be down in 3 minutes. I said, fine, no sirens, no flashing lights, just come on to the unit, just one or two of you. So a few minutes later, 2 well-dressed firemen, Topeka's finest, come through the door onto the unit into the nursing station, and we have a following chat. I described the situation, and they said, well, the first remedy, and those of you who know Bonnie Phillips and the building, those units were built on the 2nd floor, so the outside they were on stilts, and the windows were facing, east. And the fireman says, well, we could easily put a ladder up to the 2nd floor, take an axe and punch a hole through the window, and then we can take a hose and just turn it on. They will come out surely quickly. So I can imagine, you try and be a thoughtful doctor. Nothing in my graduate training or postgraduate prepared me for this. Plus, I could see the headlines once the media got this. Menninger girls lock themselves in the room, firemen poke a hole and flood them out. And I could see the insurance company and the hundreds of thousands of dollars of damage. So I say, thank you very much. Is there a plan B? Yes, plan B, says Dr. Stam, do you know the jaws of life that we use to get people out of car wrecks? Sure. He says, we can take the jaws of life in the hallway, put it against the door, and push the door back, which will push the furniture back, and you'll have access to the teenagers. That sounds like a better plan. Ira knocks on the door. Hi, young ladies, this is Dr. Stam. You ready to come out? No, we want to smoke our cigarettes. So I said, well, the fire department's here, and this is what they're proposing to do. And I explained the jaws of life and how that works. The response fairly quickly, Dr. Stam, give us 3 more minutes to finish our cigarettes and we'll come on out. End of story. I hope that'll help you not forget the children.
I wish we had time for more questions, but the people in charge, or the person in charge, says, God. Thanks, Katie. I appreciate you all coming. It's been a wonderful evening, and thank you again. Take care.
Recording stopped.